you will see how it is. When you think of the American dream, what's the first thing that you think about when we talk about the American dream?
House.
Home ownership. That's what most people think of. What is the #1 vehicle that most people use to create wealth in this country and around the world? Real estate. And when you look at the portfolio of wealthy people, the one asset that they all have in it is real estate. There's few facets of American citizenship that embody the national ideal more than home ownership. So we're going to talk about that today. We can talk about Rotary another time. Explaining the gap. Housing discrimination underpins the staggering wealth gap between Blacks and whites. And someone asked me, why is it always about Black and white? And because as human beings, we naturally go to the extremes because few Africans actually have real Black skin. Few Caucasians of European descent really have white skin. But when we talk about, when I mention Black, you can put in all people of color, basically. We have Makiko on the phone, she's listening. In the decades to follow the civil rights movement of the 60s, white wealth has soared while Black wealth has stagnated. Many also point out how many more white millionaires we have compared to Black, but we don't even need to look at millionaires. Let's just look at the middle class, where inequities are very stark. In 1968, the typical middle-class Black household had about $7,000 in wealth compared to $70,000 of the typical middle-class white household. In 2016, typical middle-class Black household had $13,000 compared to $150,000 of the median white household. In the fourth quarter of 2017, the Census Bureau, this is the last time the Census Bureau reported, that homeownership among white and non-Hispanic Americans was 73%, while African American rate was 42%. Some of you may have heard of this guy, Richard Rothstein. He wrote a book, The Color of Law. And if you have any interest in any of that, you should read the book. It's very, very interesting, very enlightening. And I'm going to play the short video. It's about 8 minutes long, but it can explain things a whole lot better than I can, and it's very interesting.
We've left untouched the biggest segregation of all. It overwhelms everything else and hangs over our entire society, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. There are clearly defined areas in every one that I've lived in that are all white or mostly white, or all African American and mostly African American. And all of us accept this as part of the natural environment. It's not that we think it's a good thing. We know, we say it's too bad, but we think it's sort of natural, normal, something we accept. It's not that we've tried to do anything about it and have failed. We've never even tried. And so in order to rationalize to ourselves our failure to undo it, we've adopted a national myth. And that myth is pervasive. It's pervasive across the political spectrum. Liberals and conservatives hold it. The Blacks and whites hold it. The name of that myth is we have de facto segregation. Not something that was created by government like all the other segregations that we undid in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, but this is something that sort of just happened by accident. It happened because people like to live with each other of the same race. Or it happened because private actors, whether they were real estate agents or bankers or private citizens, discriminated in how they sold or rented homes. Or it happened because African Americans happen to be poorer than whites on average, and therefore they can't afford to move to middle-class communities. De facto segregation is an utter myth. There is no basis to it whatsoever. The racial segregation in every metropolitan area in this country was created by explicit, racially explicit government policy designed to create racial boundaries, designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another, with policies that are so powerful that they still determine the racial landscape that we see in cities all over the country. Just like we have the myth of de facto segregation, we also think we know what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live. There are lots of mothers with children, single parents with children, lots of young men without access to jobs in the formal economy, acting out, engaging in oppositional behavior that attracts attention of the police and a cycle of violence that we've seen in so many places. That's what we think of as public housing. But that's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country as a program for middle-class, working-class families. During the Depression, poor people were not permitted into public housing when public housing was first created. There was a housing shortage, and public housing was created for people who could afford to pay the full rent in housing, and they did in public housing, but for whom there was no housing available. Everywhere, the Public Works Administration and the other federal agencies that succeeded it created segregated public housing, separate projects for African Americans and whites in cities all across the country, frequently segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated, that were integrated. During World War II, the actions of the government intensified to create segregation. They intensified because throughout the country, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production, of war production, to take jobs that hadn't existed during the Depression. And the migration of workers into centers of defense production overwhelmed frequently the communities where they were working. The federal government had to build housing for these workers if one of the ships to be produced. For the African Americans, they built the housing, temporary housing, because the explicit goal of the housing was that African Americans after World War II would leave and go back to the South. So they built temporary housing for the African Americans along the railroad tracks near the shipyards. And they built more stable housing for the white migrants in the white residential areas. Very soon after that, in the mid-1950s, a development occurred everywhere in the country, which was systematic, similar, and widespread. And that was that suddenly all the white projects began to develop large numbers of vacancies. All the black projects began to develop long waiting lists. And soon the situation became so untenable, so conspicuous, you couldn't have projects in the same city, some of which were virtually empty, and the other of which had long waiting lists. The federal government and local housing agencies opened up all projects to African Americans. And then at about the same time, industry left the cities. Fewer and fewer jobs became available to now increasingly, soon almost all African American population in the public housing. The population could no longer afford to pay the full cost of its rent, so the government had to begin subsidizing public housing. Maintenance declined in the projects. Prior to this, maintenance workers lived in the projects. They were paid good salaries and lived in the projects. Upkeep declined. The projects became vertical slums that we came to associate with public housing today. Another federal program that was perhaps even more powerful in creating racial segregation, and that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration designed to move white families out of urban areas into single-family homes in the suburbs. At a racially explicit basis, we created a white noose around every urban area with federally subsidized single-family home subdivisions. These were giant subdivisions in many cases. The most famous of them, I'm sure you've heard of it, is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend a developer the money to build 17,000 homes or 15,000 homes in one place for which he had no buyers? We were in a suburban country at that time. People thought the whole idea was lunacy. Who's going to want to live in a single family home and live in a city instead? Any of these developers, the only way they could get the capital to build these giant subdivisions was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, for approval of the construction materials they were going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets in the subdivision, and an explicit commitment not to sell a home to an African American, required by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration even required, as a condition of these guarantees, developers like Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These deeds still exist in these homes today. They're no longer enforced, no longer enforceable, but they're still there. What was the consequence of this? Well, those homes in those days, in all of these suburbs, they sold for $10,000 or less, $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's less than $100,000, probably $90,000. African Americans who were prohibited, not they didn't want to, not because they liked living among whites, they were prohibited from moving into these suburbs. And they could easily afford to do so. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for $90,000, roughly twice national median income. Those homes and developments like that now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and more. The white families of the next couple of generations gained, to do the arithmetic, $200,000, $300,000, $500,000 in equity. They used that equity to send their children to college, to take care of medical emergencies, to take care of economic downturns, most importantly, to bequeath it to their children, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who accumulated none of that wealth as a result of this federal subsidy had none of those abilities. Today, nationwide, African American incomes are on average about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth today is 10% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied. It's a constitutional violation. Of course, it determines the ongoing racial inequalities we have today.
How many of you knew that information?
I did not.
Yeah, most people didn't know. When I first found out that covenants, racial discrimination covenants, were sanctioned and demanded by the federal government, I was very, very shocked. You guys know, let's bring it home, because a lot of people say, well, that was the South, that was the North. California is very liberal. We didn't have the Jim Crow laws and the discrimination here. But you guys in Glendale, you know where Brockmont Park is, right? Like so many other upper middle class neighborhoods, there were also covenants, conditions, charges, and restrictions for Brockmont Park. And it clearly restricted ownership to Caucasians. It bluntly said that no person of African, Japanese, Chinese, or Mongolian descent shall be allowed to purchase, own, occupy, lease property in Brockmont Park. Actually, the LA Times had an advertisement saying to potential buyers that the planned residential community had carefully devised restrictions. And it wasn't until 1948 racial discrimination in the form of deed restrictions were considered legal based on the premise that enforcement of those limitations did not require state involvement. Well, actually, working in real estate again, I've seen many deeds with the restrictions in Leimert Park, View Park, Baldwin Hills, in Ladera Heights, where my husband and I lived. And Makiko actually told me that when she and her husband purchased their property, which was built in 1963, it had deed restrictions saying you cannot sell to Asians. And she told me that her uncle, who was a scientist with JPL, couldn't live where he wanted to live. So these deed restrictions, people say all of that's in the past. It wasn't that long ago. And you can read, when you get a chance, if you have your deed, look at your deed for where you live. It's still, the covenants are still, even though they're not enforced, they are still written on many of these deeds. And for some people, that's hurtful just to even see it. In the news lately, you've been hearing about the affirmatively furthering fair housing policy, and people don't know what that is and don't understand what's really happening with it because it's been misrepresented. But in 1968, the Fair Housing Act legally prevented housing discrimination, not just racially, but religious, sex, age, family. People discriminated against having families in apartment buildings. And then in 2015, the affirmatively furthering fair housing policy was added to kind of reinforce and help communities that were receiving housing funds from FHA. They are supposed to look for patterns of housing discrimination, segregation, and develop plans to help to eliminate that. And they are to review and give that assessment to the fair housing, give that assessment to HUD, I'm sorry, and HUD would review and approve their plan. Affirming fair housing in the suburbs, this is what you've been hearing about in the news. And just to let everyone know, it did not require building of low-income housing in the suburbs, nor did it require rezoning. Proponents of the fair housing policy says that this rule actually gave the Fair Housing Act more teeth and made it more enforceable. Now, nowadays, when we think of the suburbs, we think of the Inland Empire and 20, 30 miles outside of the city. But when the Fair Housing Act was put in place, LA proper, which is downtown and radiating from there maybe 5, 6 miles, was the city. Everything built around it is considered suburbs. Culver City is a suburb, Glendale is a suburb, Pasadena is a suburb, Hawthorne is a suburb. So all of these municipalities that came up around LA were suburbs and that's what he meant by the white noose around the urban city, because people of color could not move outside of the urban hub into the suburbs. The affirming fair housing policy was suspended in 2018 and has not been complied with since. It was totally rescinded this past July 2020. The new final rule allows for municipalities to simply say that they're in compliance with the tenets of the Fair Housing Act without any major documentation or accountability. And as long as they show a general commitment to keeping with the rules of fair housing, HUD will basically take their word for it. This passive approach to compliance with the Fair Housing Act via the non-enforcement and now abolished AFH rule has led to sharp increase in housing discrimination complaints. The enlightenment of the 1960s is constantly being diminished. In 2019 report from the Fair Housing Alliance, they found that there were 31,000 complaints on housing discrimination just in 2018, the highest number since the Fair Housing Alliance has been collecting data since 1995. In essence, HUD's current approach perpetuates housing discrimination by allowing, even encouraging, communities to look the other way. And this is one of the examples of how the subtleties of law perpetuates systemic inequalities based on race. 400 plus years of enforced caste system cannot be turned around in 50, 60 years. People say, why don't you get over it? Why don't they just move on from there? America is the land of opportunity. Everybody has a chance to build and grow. But although the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968 represented a huge step toward ensuring that all Americans had a chance to live where they choose, dismantling racially discriminatory practices has been a continuously sporadic, decades-long process. And this is the reason that people continue to march, continue to be enraged, because with cell phone, the advent of cell phone, more and more and more is exposed to the general public. And so people can see the systemic disparities. So anyway, thank you very much. This is one of my favorite thoughts. They have to be carefully taught. It came from the movie South Pacific, but it says so much and it covers so much. They have to be carefully taught. Thank you.